I'm Turk Strongman. Thank you for selecting this video. The Kybalion's New Clothes, an early 20th century text's dubious association with Hermeticism by Nicholas E. Chappell. C-H-A-P-E-L. If you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, pause the video right now and do it. While you're at it, activate the notification bell feature. If you like the video, give it a thumb up. If you don't like it, give it your other thumb up. Just don't give it your middle finger. Share the joy of the channel with others. Now let's move forward. This is a scholarly paper, again called The Kybalion's New Clothes, an early 20th century text's dubious association with Hermeticism by Nicholas E. Chappell, having been published in the Journal of Western Mystery Tradition, number 24, volume 3, Vernall Equinox, 2013. Why am I doing this? Well, I'm narrating and posting here, uploading The Kybalion by 3 initiates. I went to lengths in a 2-part, 2-video introduction of my own to the playlist, which is the series of, the narration of the book, chapter by chapter. In my introduction, I bring forth some reservations and considerations regarding the authenticity of certain of the claims in the book. Claims about Hermetic philosophy, Hermetica, as well as claims about what the book is really doing, how it arose, what it is. Okay. I bring this up now. I am going to an authoritative academic source along these same lines. Okay. Why? Because I think that given the popularity of the book, The Kybalion, which in the public mind, among whom it is popular, and members of which it is popular, very popular and relied upon as authoritative, it goes unchallenged. That genuineness, that the authoritativeness of the book remains unchallenged. For one thing, it sure is written like it's authoritative, and the author, the known author of it, like one of the 3 initiates, William Walker Atkinson, is taken to be such an authority on all such things, unquestioned. Well, I narrate a significant portion of his works here on my channel. But in my introduction to this one, The Kybalion, I state my reservations. I state my observations. I state my opinions. And I ground them in outside sources, but without going much into those outside sources. That's what I'm doing here. I think that given the popularity of The Kybalion, and the contrasting lack of critical analysis in the public mind concerning that book, I'm trying to balance those 2 things out. I'm trying to bring the critical analysis up to being on a par with the popularity of the book. So what I'm about to present here by Nicholas Chappell, it's available, but who looks into it? Who knows of it? Who reads it? Who considers it? Probably very few people. So, let's go. The Kybalion's New Clothes, an early 20th century text's dubious association with Hermeticism by Nicholas Chappell, Journal of Western Mystery Tradition, number 24, volume 3, Vernall Equinox, 2013, So, by the way, this is not a public domain article. I intend no copyright infringement whatsoever. I am doing this for the reason that I gave. I am not doing this for profit. I'm giving credit where credit is due, and I think it should be more publicly accessed, this article. So, introduction. The Kybalion, published in 1912 by the pseudonymous Three Initiates, is widely regarded as a classic of 20th century esotericism. The work consists of aphorisms from the eponymous text, as well as extensive commentary thereon. It outlines several principles or universal laws upon which, it claims, quote, the entire Hermetic philosophy is based, end of quote. A proper understanding and application of these laws, according to the text, will allow an individual to achieve self-mastery. It is now generally acknowledged that the Kybalion, both as a collection of aphorisms and its encompassing commentary, was a product of the late 19th and early 20th century New Thought movement, likely written single-handedly by William Walker Atkinson. Despite widespread acceptance of this position, however, the Kybalion's self-proclaimed association with Hermeticism has gone largely unchallenged. Philip Dislepy, in his introduction to the Penguin Tarcher edition of the Kybalion, has much to say about the New Thought context out of which the work arose, and makes a convincing argument for Atkinsonian authorship. But at the same time, he enthusiastically promotes the Kybalion as an inheritor of Hermetic tradition, claiming that it bridged the occult worlds of the 19th and the 20th centuries, pulling together esoteric teachings and organizing them in such a way that they would uniquely inspire a vast and diverse group of seekers until the present day. While the latter may be true, the assertion that the Kybalion is an example of Hermetic philosophy, or even an inheritor thereof, is on considerably shakier ground. To be sure, the Kybalion is firmly ensconced within the Western esoteric tradition. It is, however, consonant with the, but is it, however, is it consonant with the particular milieu of Hermeticism? This study undertakes a critical analysis of the thought of the Kybalion as compared with and contrasted to ancient and modern Hermetic thought in order to answer this question. Additionally, while the association of the Kybalion with New Thought is by no means a novel concept, analyses detailing the commonalities between the two bodies of work have hitherto been largely cursory in nature. Thus, one of the goals of this study is to illustrate more clearly the ways in which the Kybalion evinces New Thought doctrine and to frame it appropriately within this context. The Kybalion thus being situated within its appropriate historical framework, the study will then proceed to evaluate the Kybalion's connection, or lack thereof, to Hermeticism as an historical current. Spurious antiquity. Although the Kybalion pretends antiquity, it is decidedly a product of modernity. The principle of vibration which the aphorisms so heavily emphasize, for example, originated in the middle of the 18th century with the British philosopher and medical doctor David Hartley, 1705 to 1757. The commentary on the aphorisms is decidedly of 20th century provenance, referring as it does to works that were not published until the early 1900s. The overwhelming likelihood is that the aphorisms were penned concurrently with the commentary text in the early 20th century, and presented as a product of ancient thought in order to afford it the veneer of respectability that religion acquires when associated with historic tradition. Nor was this practice at all uncommon within the New Thought movement. Horatio Wills Dresser, a prominent figure in New Thought circles, freely admits that, quote, the tendency is to attribute to the new thought far more than can with historical accuracy be claimed for it. End of quote. He furthermore states that, quote, this history of the new thought might disappoint some readers if they had made up in their minds that it is necessary to look into the far past and to discover ideas in India, in ancient Greece, in the Middle Ages, which resemble the therapeutic ideas of today. Closed quote. The false pretension of the Kybalion's antiquity extends even to the name of the text itself. The word Kybalion takes the form of a Greek noun, but has no meaning in that language or in any other. It is possible that the name was constructed with a similarity in mind to the word Kabbalah, and others have speculated that it was inspired by the Greco-Roman goddess Cybele. Cybele. I don't know the pronunciation. And in Greek, the Kubele, Kubele, with a straight line over that last E. But as Deslepi points out, quote, the lack of any correspondence or reference to either of them within the Kybalion suggests that, if anything, these are nothing more than coincidence. Closed quote. Rather than coincidence, however, it seems the more likely explanation that the title was chosen as an allusion to one or both of these sources to insinuate a link to antiquity. The text itself is silent on this point, saying only that, quote, the exact significance and meaning of the terms have been lost for several centuries, end of quote. Presenting the Kybalion. The Kybalion's central thesis is that existence is governed by 7 universal laws. The principles of mentalism, correspondence, vibration, polarity, rhythm, cause and effect, and gender. Briefly stated, these principles, when taken as a whole, outline a form of philosophical idealism, in which the universe exists in the mind of deity, that the macrocosm corresponds to the microcosm, that the differences between varying states of matter, mind, and spirit are a result of differing rates of vibration, that everything has its opposite, but that all opposites are ultimately identical in nature, that there is a natural swing back and forth between opposing extremes, and that every cause has an effect and vice versa, and that everything evinces both male and female qualities. The Kybalion then goes on to detail a skill of mental transmutation, which is defined as the, quote, the art of changing and transforming mental states, forms, and conditions into others, end of quote, by proper understanding and application of these universal laws. At first glance, these principles are all consonant with Hermetic philosophy. A deeper investigation into both the thought itself and the corresponding historical context, however, reveals that the work is overwhelmingly representative of the American New Thought movement, which arose in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The New Thought connection. Originally known under many names, including mental science, Christian science, and mind cure, before crystallizing under the overarching name of New Thought in the 1890s, the New Thought was fundamentally a popular American self-help psychology originating in the 1870s that promised mastery through self-discipline. In 1889, with the advent of William Juvenile Colville's The Spiritual Science of Health and Healing, The therapies associated with the New Thought became spiritualized, quote, in a manner typical of believers in mediumship or spiritism, close quote. Thus, while hitherto a scientific spiritual doctrine, spiritual doctrine, New Thought thereafter forged its spiritual roots in American mesmerism. The exertion of mind over matter that was a central preoccupation of the New Thought was achieved by, quote, putting ourselves in new relation to the world about us by changing our thought concerning it, close the quote. Horatio Wills Dresser expounds further upon this principle in his introduction to the spirit of the New Thought when he states that the doctrine, quote, is a theory and method of mental life with special reference to healing and to the fostering of attitudes, modes of conduct, and beliefs which make for health and general welfare. The theory in brief is that man leads an essentially mental life influenced, shaped, and controlled by anticipations, hopes, and suggestions. End of quote. This indeed is the focus of the mental transmutation outlined in the Kybalion. A central component of mental transmutation as found in the New Thought was the law of attraction. Within New Thought, the primary emphasis of this transmutation was on the healing of the body and mind. Physical disease was considered to be an outward expression of one's inner state, which was regarded as the focal point of attraction. By changing one's mental attitude through affirmations and positive thinking, disease could therefore be cured and troubling mental states overcome. While the mind over matter principle was most visibly applied to illness and wellness, however, as time went on, it was applied to other areas, including happiness and spiritual attainment. Excuse me. The understanding and proper application of thought and attitude, then, was regarded as essentially salvific. 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 In contrast to the old thought, which was undeniably pessimistic, this is in quotes, was undeniably pessimistic, dwelt on sin, emphasized the darkness and misery of the world and the distress and the suffering, close quote. New Thought, quote again, dwelt on life and light, pointing the way to the mastery of all sorrow and suffering, close quote. The New Thought emphasis on salvific knowledge often comes in the guise of a doctrine of universal law. In all things, according to Dresser, there is but one law. That law is good. It is the foundation principle of the universe. But through ignorance, man temporarily suffers and causes suffering because he knows not the universality of the law, because he looks outside of his own inner world for the cause. End of quote. The New Thought, on the other hand, asserts that it is possible for the soul to command the mind, so long as we in turn obey the laws of the mind. When the content of the Kybalion is examined in light of the New Thought philosophy, it becomes readily apparent that the text is heavily representative of that milieu. This association becomes even clearer when the work of William Walker Atkinson, the probable author of the Kybalion, is examined in closer detail. The case for Atkinsonian authorship. William Walker Atkinson was an influential figure in the New Thought movement, serving as an editor of several publications and writing abundantly on a variety of topics, often pseudonymously. Excuse me. He variously referred to his writings as practical occultism, new psychology, and new thought. The half-dozen pseudonyms he wrote under were similarly colorful and diverse, including Yogi Ramacharaka, Theron Q. Dumont, and Magus Incognito. He was additionally a prolific lecturer and served for a time as the honorary vice president of the International New Thought Alliance. Philip Dislepi, in his introduction to the Penguin Tarcher edition of the Kybalion, makes a strong case for ascribing sole authorship of the text to Atkinson. He dismantles many of the other common speculations as to who the author of the Kybalion might be, and provides evidence that is at least highly suggestive as to Atkinson being the real face behind the three initiates. Among other similarities, he points out the overwhelmingly common theme of 7 cosmic or universal laws in Atkinson's work. Remarkable as well is the fact that in the 1912 edition of Who's Who in America, Atkinson's self-submitted, biographical entry includes the Kybalion among his list of works. Perhaps most compelling to anyone who has encountered Atkinson's other writings, however, is the uncanny similarity in style between his other works and the Kybalion. Dislepi himself observes that there are similarities of content, format, and source material that do not exist with any other writer. And indeed that, when placed alongside Atkinson's other works from the same period, the style of the Kybalion is consistent and seamless with them, employing the same tone, voice, and quirks of syntax and word choice. Upon even the most cursory examination of Atkinson's other writings, it becomes readily apparent that these similarities are pervasive. His emphasis on vibrations, on mental transmutation, on the law of attraction, and on cosmic law in general strongly echoes the content and prose of the Kybalion. In Thought Vibration, or the Law of Attraction in the Thought World, published contemporaneously with the Kybalion, he specifically uses the phrase thought transmutation and refers to this secret of the will as the magic key which opens all doors. He further develops this idea of the ancient key in the Law of the New Thought when he states that ancient writers, this is a quote, ancient writers have carefully placed bits of esoteric truth among writings of wide circulation, known that only those with the key could read. End of quote. He continues, quoting again, the idea of the oneness of all is at the center of all religious thought, although it is hidden until one finds the key. It is the key that opens all doors. End of quote. Compare this to the Kybalion, which states that its intent is, quote, to place in the hands of the student a master key with which he may open the many inner doors in the temple of mystery through the main portals he has already entered. End of quote. The focus on the concept of vibrations and the way in which this material is presented is also strikingly similar between Atkinson's other works and the Kybalion. In Thought Vibration, Atkinson declares that the light and heat are manifested by vibrations of a far lower intensity than those of thought, but the difference is solely in the rate of vibration. compare this to the Kybalion, which states that, quoting again, the Hermetic teachings are to the effect that spirit is at one end of the pole of vibration, the other pole being certain extremely gross forms of matter. End of quote. Atkinson also denies the existence of chance in both thought vibration and the Kybalion. In the former, he states that there's no such thing as chance. Law maintains everywhere, and all that happens because of the operation of law. The Kybalion similarly proclaims that everything happens according to law. Chance is but a name for law not recognized. End of quote. There is also a curious focus on the distinction between fear and courage. In the Kybalion, we are told that in the case of a fearful man, he can be filled with the highest degree of courage and fearlessness by raising his mental vibrations along the line of fear to courage. In thought vibration, Atkinson advises, when you feel fearful, remember that the real self fears nothing and assert courage. Now here the prose is so similar that Atkinson even applies the same idiosyncratic capitalization in both works, which should perhaps be unsurprising, given that the two works were published within 1 year of each other. Nor is Walker's claim of an ancient origin for the Kybalion's New Thought an unusual one. Various authors connected the New Thought with Theosophy, Spiritism, Pantheism, the religion of India, and the teachings of Emanuel Swedenborg. The New Thought naturally found varied expressions because it appealed to individuals of different types. Each one gained the central ideas and then began to develop his special views around them. Atkinson himself quite notably and consistently claims that there is nothing new about this truth. The same thing has been said by ancient philosophers of India 5,000 years ago, by the philosophers of Greece 2,500 years ago, by Berkeley, Hegel, and Kant and their followers. Atkinson expounds on this further in the Law of the New Thought when he states that the New Thought is the oldest thought in existence. It has been cherished by the chosen few in all ages, the masses of the people, not having been ready for its teachings. It has been called by all names, has appeared in all guises, Atkinson says. He goes on to state that the doctrine of the New Thought contains, quote, mighty truths which have nestled in the bosom of the esoteric teachings of all religions, in the philosophies of the past and present, in the temples of the Orient, in the schools of ancient Greece, end of quote. Indeed, the first part of the Law of New Thought is rife with vague references to occult lore and mystical principles. Dresser strongly objects to this pretension of antiquity. However, stating that, quote, the New Thought differs from the idealisms of the past just because it disregards them and starts on a practical basis. Luckily, its pioneers were uninformed in these ancient systems. End quote. And indeed, Atkinson does seem remarkably uninformed when it comes to Hermetic philosophy, as we shall soon discover. Commonalities with Hermeticism. To be fair, there is some overlap between the thought of the Kybalion and the Hermetic philosophy. The most obvious connection with Hermeticism, and perhaps the only point of connection entirely specific to Hermetic philosophy itself, is, of course, the Kybalion's use of the often quoted Hermetic axiom from the Emerald Tablet of Hermes Trismegistus, rendered in the Kybalion as above, so below, as below, so above. The Kybalion affirms the correspondence of the macrocosm and the microcosm, stating that, quote, there is a harmony, agreement, and correspondence, between the several planes of manifestation, life, and being, end of quote. Apart from its expression in the Emerald Tablet, this concept is echoed in the Asclepius. Number 4. Quote, all earthly things are images, reflections of their eternal forms within God, and in this sense, the world is an image of God. End of quote. The doctrine that the physical world is a reflection of the eternal forms within God is common to the Platonic milieu in general, contributing to a shared idealist cosmology between the Kybalion and Hermeticism. Israel Regardie expounds upon the nature of Hermetic idealism when he states that the Kabbalah itself, a Platonizing form of mysticism, quote, is an objective idealism. All our perceptions are not exclusively of the ego, nor of that which is perceived. They are representations of a certain relation and interaction between the two, end of quote. This is true not only of the Kabbalah, of course, but to the entirety of Hermetic philosophy, stretching back to the Corpus Hermeticum itself. The Hermeticism of late antiquity held that the world was an image of God, which inherently presupposes the Middle Platonist view that the ideas, that is, the forms after which Plato's demiurge created the world, are enclosed in the mind, nous, N-O-U-S, of the Supreme God as his thoughts, end of quote. The Kybalion is thus in agreement with Hermeticism, and indeed with the entirety of the Platonic milieu, when it states that all is mind. Nor, however, does this commonality lie with Hermeticism alone. Philosophical idealism is a common feature of the New Age movement as a whole, as is the idea of evolution that the Kybalion so readily embraces. Indeed, states Hanegraaff, Hanegraaff, quote, the type of idealism which proved most congenial to the new evolutionism saw the external world as depending on an absolute mind, which was at once the type, sum, and ground of all individual minds, the individual soul universalized. End of quote. The concept of consciously overcoming the base desires and impulses of the individual by use of one's higher faculties, as it were overcoming the will with the will, is also central to the Kybalion's philosophy, and is in fact a prerequisite for the mental transmutation which it promotes. The average person, the Kybalion states, is too lazy to act, and such persons are ruled almost entirely by the minds and wills of other persons, whom they allow to do their thinking and willing for them. Whereas the strong men and women of the world dominate their own minds by their will. End of quote. Dion Fortune agrees with this assessment when she states that, quote, the direction of the energies of life must be removed from the domain of the desires to that of the will. Until this is done, there can be no steady progression in any direction, for the desires are called forth from without, not directed from within, and vary with the external stimulus. End of quote. In addition to the principles of correspondence and mentalism already addressed, the principles of polarity and gender espoused within the Kybalion also find purchase within Hermetic philosophy. The Kybalion states that everything is dual, everything has poles, everything has its pair of opposites. This concept of polarity can be found in Kabbalistic cosmology, in the dual pillars of Masonic and Golden Dawn temple symbolism, and in a variety of other locations within modern Hermetic thought. John Michael Greer articulates this principle as it applies to Hermetic philosophy when he states, quote, "The essential idea behind the principle of polarity is that anything in the universe can be understood in magical terms as an energy relationship between two opposed forces, resulting in a third balanced force. The principle of gender, which can be viewed as a more specific articulation of that polarity, also finds expression within Hermetic philosophy, dating back to the Corpus Hermeticum. Quote, that God is androgynous is repeatedly stated in the Poemander, according to the Asclepius. God is completely filled with the fecundity of both sexes. The Asclepius continues, not only God is of both sexes, but all things ensouled and soulless, for it is impossible for any of the things that are to be infertile. End of quote. Thus, the Kybalion is in agreement with long-standing Hermetic tradition when it states that everything in the organic world manifests both genders. There was always the masculine present in the feminine form. Diverging viewpoints. With at least 4 of the 7 core principles of the Kybalion clearly attested within Hermetic sources, and the principle of vibration so common within the New Age movement that it bears no comment, it is an easy mental leap to associate the text as a whole with the Hermetic philosophy it claims to represent. This association is an appealing one, but is ultimately based upon relatively superficial commonalities. When one delves deeper into the core of Hermetic philosophy, the resemblances quickly begin to fall apart. The most readily visible divergence takes place in the realm of cosmology. In common with all Platonizing philosophies, Hermeticism speaks of a multiplicity of emanations from the Godhead. Accounts differ in number, but the pattern is the same. The one God gives rise to lesser deities or principles, the last of which is responsible for creating the physical world as demiurgos. When Pico de la Mirandola wedded Kabbalah to Hermeticism, the prevailing cosmological view was irrevocably changed to the Kabbalistic tenfold structure. This model would prove to overshadow the original cosmologies of the Hermetica. Common to all, however, is the concept of a finite number of discrete manifestations, the final or lowest of which constitutes what we perceive as physical reality. In contradistinction to this view, the Kybalion posits a vastly different model of existence. The Kybalion begins its exposition on cosmology by dividing the universe into the 3 great classes of phenomena known as the 3 great planes. In other words, the spiritual, the mental, and the physical. Now, this tripartite division between anima, spiritus, and corpus is an uncontroversial one, having a long history not merely within Western esotericism as a whole, but also in exoteric theology. As the Kybalion's cosmological view is expounded further, however, the similarity rapidly deteriorates. The Hermetists, the Kybalion claims, subdivide each of the three great planes into 7 minor planes, and each of these latter are also subdivided into 7 subplanes, all divisions being more or less arbitrary, shading into each other, and adopted merely for convenience of scientific study and thought. The number 7 could conceivably be taken to refer to the 7 classical planets. But this is a stretch. And the further 7-fold subdivision results in no less than a 147-fold cosmological scheme. Even more dissonant with the Platonic foundation upon which Hermeticism as an historical current is built is the claim that each of these divisions are arbitrary and continuous. The divisions in Hermetic cosmology, whether those detailed in the Hermetica or those in the later Kabbalistic model, are most definitely neither of these. Even more strangely, while in Hermetic thought we are all believed to operate on the planes of body, mind, and spirit simultaneously, this does not seem to be the case in the Kybalion's idiosyncratic perspective. Instead, we are held to occupy only a single one of the 147 planes at a time. And the destiny of the human race is to evolve ever toward the higher planes. The average man of today, the Kybalion states, occupies but the 4th subdivision of the plane of human mind, and only the most intelligent have crossed the borders of the 5th subdivision. It has taken the race millions of years to reach this stage, and it will take many more years for the race to move on to the 6th and the 7th subdivisions and beyond. End of quote. Thus our destiny is not to rise mystically along the plains and unite with the Godhead, but rather to evolve along a slow and plodding path as a species toward this end goal. Even the deities of mankind, the Kybalion claims, are mortals like us. Quote, we may call them gods if we like, but they are elder brethren of the race, the advanced souls who have outstripped their brethren, who have foregone the ecstasy of absorption by the all in order to help the race on its upward journey along the path. End of quote. Well, it's curious that nowhere else in the text is mention made of this ecstatic union with the Godhead. But this lack of emphasis seems typical for the Kybalion. Indeed, the differences in cosmology are almost trivial compared to the fundamental difference in the focus of the Kybalion as contrasted with that of Hermeticism across its 2 millennia. Hermeticism is and always has been centrally and unwaveringly focused on the experiential knowledge of divinity. This is apparent from the very first lines of the Poemander, in which the narrator states his greatest desire, quote, I wish to learn about the things that are, to understand their nature, and to know God. End of quote. The focus on salvific knowledge is so central to Hermeticism that in the Poemander CH 7, DII, we are told that the greatest evil of mankind is ignorance concerning God. End of quote. Even the common cosmological emphasis of the Hermetica revolves around this preoccupation. The overarching concern of the authors of the Hermetica was the ultimate cause of the universe, God, and therefore the aim of all their discussions on cosmology and creation was to bring the reader or listener through admiration of the cosmos to the adoration of and mystical union with the Supreme God. End of quote. The point of all the discussion of the nature of the universe, the gods, the heavens and the earth, was to elevate the audience to the divine gnosis. In contrast, the Kybalion focuses on knowledge of the nature of the universe as a means to attaining knowledge of the universal laws, in order that this knowledge in turn may facilitate the practice of mental transmutation, which is a central focus of the text. Nor is this knowledge the gnosis of the Hermetica. The knowledge of the universal law spoken of in the Kybalion does not represent an experiential knowledge attained through an encounter with divinity. Instead, it is an intellectual understanding of the principles of universal law and the technique of mental transmutation. As technical knowledge, this would fall under the Greek concept of episteme rather than that of gnosis. The aim of the new thought, and with it the Kybalion, was to eliminate the false beliefs, the errors of mind, which had held people in subjection. The emphasis of the Kybalion was not on gnosis, but on neosis, in the sense that its focus was purely intellectual comprehension. This is in sharp contrast to the divine gnosis, which refers not to rational philosophical knowledge, but to religious spiritual insight based on revelation. The Hermetica, along with the overarching milieu of Middle Platonism, out of which Hermeticism arose, display an idealist view of the cosmos. The universe is created out of the mind of the divine, and indeed the term mind, nous, is synonymous with the highest God. Given the central focus of the Kybalion on the mind and mental transmutation, one would therefore naturally be inclined to assume that these principles are consonant with the worldview of Hermeticism. And indeed, there is nothing contrary to Hermetic philosophy in the concept of mental transmutation, but the mind is spoken of in the Kybalion is not the mind of the Hermetica. The Hermetica distinguished between mind, nous, as the supreme God, the one, the good, and the second God or demiurge called the Logos. The thought of the Kybalion is decidedly focused on Logos. And this is a central distinction between Hermetic thought and that of the Kybalion. The emphasis of the Hermetica is on the divine mind as the highest expression of the Godhead. All else flows from this perfect mind, and the object of the Hermetists was to reunite themselves with mind. The Kybalion, on the other hand, sets the stage by espousing that the world exists within the macrocosmic mind of the highest, and then proceeds to shift its emphasis thereafter to the transmutation of the microcosmic of the individual. The Kybalion then is fundamentally concerned with mind with a small m rather than mind, let's say, with a capital M, with Logos rather than with nous. Now, according to Hermeticism, according to Hermeticism, is Logos the proper focus of one's reverence, which should only be on the divine nous. All those who heeded the proclamation of God and immersed themselves in mind participated in knowledge and became perfect people because they received mind. But those who missed the point of the proclamation are people of reason because they did not receive the gift of mind as well and do not know the purpose or the agents of their coming to be. End of a quote. Given the Greek terminology used in that passage, ebaptisano, being a form of the same verb meaning to baptize, a more revealing if somewhat looser translation of the former sentence above, taking into account the connotations of the vocabulary, would be, all those who baptized themselves in the Godhead participated in revelatory knowledge and became perfect people because they received God. Now, far from directing one's reverence toward the nous of the Godhead, the Kybalion evinces a complete lack of emphasis on piety. The concept of reverence, eusebia, is absolutely central to Hermetic philosophy, and the focus on the interrelationship between God, the world, and humanity is a predominant component of this thought. It is not through the Kybalion's practice of mental transmutation, according to the Hermetica, but rather through reverence that one's thoughts are changed. Reverence, Eusebia, is knowledge, or gnosis, of God. The one who has come to know God, filled with all good things, has thoughts that are divine, and not like those of the multitude. The unanimous aim of the Hermetists was to bring the reader to the praise and worship of the supreme God, who is not visible or knowable, but evident within the visible, in the poimander, in the discourse on the Ogdoad, and the Ennead, the Ogdoad and the Ennead. Oh, excuse me. The authors go even further and to describe ecstatic experiences in which the hermetist leaves his earthly state behind and feels himself united with the supreme God or the universe. In fairness to Atkinson, it should be noted that the Nag Hammadi codices, and therefore the text of the discourse on the Ogdoad and the Ennead, were not discovered until 1945 and thus were unknown during the writing of the Kybalion, and the definitions were not published until 1956. Regardless of the considerable differences that exist, in the expressions of Hermetic mysticism in the Corpus Hermeticum, however, they all have in common that the Hermetist comes to an intuitive knowledge of himself, the universe, and God, a knowledge that transcends the ordinary human mental faculties and is experienced as a unification with the ground of being, God. The Kybalion evinces none of this emphasis on ecstatic experience of unity with the divine or the attainment of salvific gnosis. All in all, the Kybalion seems to commit the error of confusing the means with the end. Mental transmutation is held to be the pinnacle of Hermetic philosophy. A small amount of textual analysis serves powerfully to reinforce this impression. Of the 22 instances in which traits and abilities are ascribed to the masters or the Hermetists, terms which are used interchangeably, every one of them pertains to the ability to control their mental world, to dominating their moods, transmuting and mastering their mental states, attaining emotional stability, and to developing powers to control the world around them thereby. Even the passages pertaining to the master or the hermetist controlling cause and effect come back in the final analysis to the control of emotional and mental states. Their superhuman power in the end is nothing more than a form of mental continence. Their mastery is attained by understanding the natural laws and putting them into practice rather than rising on the planes to achieve ecstatic union with the Godhead. It may be granted that this emphasis on cosmic law and its proper application does have a place within Hermetic philosophy. Dion Fortune, in training the work of an initiate, lists as her 3 divisions of occultism: harmonization with cosmic law by means of right understanding, adjustment of disharmonies by means of the right use of the power that knowledge gives, and purification of the soul by good works in all planes. The Kybalion, of course, shows heavy emphasis on at least the first 2 points. And if we interpret the mental self-mastery of the Kybalion's masters and their ability to shape the world around them, thereby as applied to the achievement of good works, we can include the latter principle as well. But Fortune goes on to state that there is nothing intrinsically spiritual about any of these 3 things. Yet nevertheless, they are the first 3 steps of the stair that leads up to the heights of the spirit. Thus, this knowledge of the universal laws and the harmonization of the individual therewith is merely the beginning of the journey. rather than the end goal as portrayed in the Kybalion. The Hermetica themselves are consistent with this point as they incarnate, with this point, as well as when they state in CH 3 through 4, and through the wonder-working course of the cycling gods, they created every soul incarnate to contemplate heaven, the works of God, and the working of nature, to know divine power, and to discover every means of working skillfully with things that are good. For them, this is the beginning of the virtuous life and of the wise thinking, as far as the course of the cycling gods destines it. The Hermetica thus concur that this knowledge and its consequent power is the beginning of the virtuous life, rather than the goal thereof. For a text that purports to be a work of Hermetic philosophy, the Kybalion has surprisingly little to say about God. Atkinson does speak of the all, with some frequency, but this seems rather like a means to an end. After the rudiments of cosmology and the attributes of God are laid out, little attention is given to them, beyond their role in supporting the underlying structure of the universe, which facilitates the technique of mental transmutation. In fact, the Kybalion is vehemently and explicitly anti-theological in its orientation, a trait which seems decidedly odd in juxtaposition to the orientation of Hermetic philosophy. In the Kybalion, we are told that theology means the attempts of men to ascribe personality, qualities, and characteristics to the all. Their theories regarding its affairs, will, desires, plans, and designs, and their assumption of the office of middleman between the all and the people. That was a quote. And are further told that theology and metaphysics seem like broken reeds rooted in the quicksands of ignorance. Another quote. Ironically, immediately after decrying the ascription of qualities and characteristics to the all, Atkinson himself proceeds within the very same page to ascribe to it the qualities and characteristics of infinity, omnipotence, immutability, and eternality. Although the Kybalion grants the terms religion and philosophy greater credence, saying that these refer to things having roots in reality, this distinction is at best a specious one. It is impossible to determine what this so-called reality is without resort to some sort of metaphysical and theological assumptions. There is the suggestion that, what constitutes reality should simply be taken as axiomatic. But while this may be rhetorically appealing, that what we do is religion and philosophy, and what they do is theology. It is philosophically fraught with difficulty. Just as there is no such thing as a free lunch, so too there is no such thing as a free metaphysics. In stark contrast to the position of the Kybalion, Hermetic philosophy has always engaged heavily in theologizing. The Hermetica are rife with descriptions of God and the nature of ultimate reality, of talk of the various middlemen between God and man in the disguise of demiurges as well as planetary osiarchs, the intelligible and the sensible gods and various other entities, and of the relationship between divinity and humanity. The philosophical Hermetica, according to Copenhagen, quote, deal instead with theological or, in some loose sense, philosophical issues. They reveal to man knowledge of the origins, nature, and moral properties of divine, human, and material being, so that man can use this knowledge to save himself. The same pious philosophy or philosophical piety, a blend of theology, cosmogony, anthropogeny, ethics, soteriology, and eschatology, also characterizes the Latin Asclepius, while finding the Hermetica wildly disparate in their teachings, identified a certain attitude of piety a certain turn of mind that lies in bending every philosophical inquiry in the direction of piety and knowledge of God, end of quote, as the only common thread running throughout the entirety of the corpus. This constitutes the central preoccupation of the Hermetica. To disparage theology, then, is in some measure tantamount to denouncing the Hermetica themselves. And finally, modern perspectives on the Kybalion. Thus far, we have seen that while the Kybalion holds a certain degree of consonance with Hermeticism as an historical current, the divergences, therefore, are many and profound. Contemporary authors, however, seem strangely determined to exonerate the Kybalion from criticism that would cast the text as not authentically Hermetic. Sleppy, in his introduction to the Penguin Tarcher edition of the Kybalion, defends the work on this point. A surprising move, given his work in unmasking Atkinson as the sole author and associating the text with the New Thought movement in which Atkinson was ensconced. When Sleppy acknowledges that the Hermetic axioms of the Kybalion likely had their origin in Atkinson's own thought rather than in long-standing tradition, he maintains that the elements of the Kybalion that would later be contested or maligned, are perfectly aligned to the spirit of Hermeticism's history. He then continues on to make his apology in several distinct points. His argument. In the first of these, he states that to critique the Kybalion for being a type of unwashed, inauthentic spiritual teaching, or to be preoccupied with Atkinson's use of a synonym, or to question the authority of the text, is to, in some sense, attack it for being traditionally Hermetic. The practice of synonymous authorship was indeed commonplace throughout the history of Hermeticism, but while Atkinson's synonymous authorship can be defended, it does not render the text authentically Hermetic. Nor does the emphasis on cosmic law, as Sleppy implies when he states that it was common for groups existing under the banner of Hermeticism to describe the universe in terms of cosmic or universal laws. End of quote. Both of these practices were and still are widespread in numerous milieux, not merely that of Hermeticism. The focus on cosmic law is common to the entirety of modern New Age movement, of which New Thought was a seminal component, and synonymous authorship has been so common a practice over the millennia that it needs no further comment. Sleppy proceeds to associate the Kybalion with Hermeticism via reference to the Tabula Smaragdina, or the Emerald Tablet, saying the closest parallel to an imagined ancient Kybalion, he states, would have been the Hermetic Emerald Tablet. The brief 13 lines of the Emerald Tablet roughly provide a similar structure as the 7 Hermetic laws of the Kybalion, and both employ the famous Hermetic line, as above, so below. He further claims that while the Emerald Tablet reduced Hermetic philosophy into a series of short axioms, the Kybalion argues its point, explaining and detailing each axiom and providing an underlying framework for them. This is an exceedingly bizarre claim, one which can only be taken either as a rather far-fetched attempt to lend Kybalion an Hermetic veneer, or as evidence of a profound lack of familiarity with the Emerald Tablet itself. The Emerald Tablet is the origin of as below, so above, as above, so below axiom, yes, which Atkinson echoes in the Kybalion. But the similarity between the two texts ends there. Apart from this single sentence, the Emerald Tablet offers no axioms, much less a similar structure to the Kybalion's 7 Hermetic laws. If the strongest similarity between the Kybalion and Hermeticism is to be found in the Emerald Tablet, the relation between the two is very sparse indeed. Sleppy is by no means the only author who has defended the Kybalion against charges that it is inauthentically hermetic. Richard Smoley, author of a number of works on Western esotericism and the former editor of Gnosis magazine, concedes that, quote, the aphorisms, in the Kybalion are very likely a pious fraud, end of quote. But while he holds that there is a major difference between the original Hermetic teachings and the new thought-flavored doctrines of the Kybalion, he nonetheless believes that it would be mistaken to conclude that this work is unfaithful to the tradition it invokes. As we have seen, however, it is not merely the original Hermetica with which the Kybalion differs through the comparison with the Corpus Hermeticum, though, the comparison with the Corpus Hermeticum provides the most visible evidence of the work's divergence with Hermetic thought as a whole. The roots of gnosis, reverence, and ecstatic communion with the divine that were planted in late antiquity have remained essential to Hermeticism, even as it has sprouted numerous offshoot branches throughout the Renaissance and modernity. Despite the centrality of the above values to Hermetic philosophy, however, one must question whether all texts claiming to be inheritors of the Hermetic tradition need necessarily evince all of these characteristics. Hermeticism is a broad tent, one which has given rise to numerous expressions of theory and practice. But while it is not necessary for a text to engage in theologizing in order to find a comfortable place within the Hermetic milieu, it should at least not be starkly disconsonant with the established body of thought, particularly if the text claims to be a work of Hermetic philosophy, as does the Kybalion. It is answerable to the extant body of philosophy within the Hermetica and other works. The text fails on this count. As such, the long-standing supposition that the Kybalion is consonant with Hermetic philosophy as an historical current is one that is erroneous and in need of revision. Hermeticism has long appropriated ideas and even entire systems which have not originated from within its own milieu. As a heavily syncretic movement, both in ancient and modern times, it incorporates an eclectic mix of topics. To the original Greco-Egyptian pagan Gnosticism of the Corpus Hermeticum, Renaissance philosophers added Jewish Kabbalism and angelic magic. John Dee contributed an entire scheme of Enochian thought and practice. In the 17th century, Rosicrucianism flourished under the banner of Hermes Trismegistus. The Golden Dawn contributed its paramasonic ritual influence and provided a coherent structure, the likes of which hadn't been seen since Agrippa's De Occulta Philosophia 4.5 centuries earlier. Even these, however, represent the logical evolution of the Greco-Egyptian magical literature of the so-called technical Hermetica, and evince a focus on the divine that is entirely lacking in the Kybalion. Can the Kybalion today be considered a part of the Hermetic tradition simply by reason of its widespread acceptance therein? Possibly so. But this is purely by virtue of assimilation, rather than by virtue of its own essential qualities. In the final analysis, the Kybalion says nothing about the Hermetic tradition, even if the contemporary Hermetic tradition has much to say about the Kybalion. I concur. Did you like the video? Thumb up. Did you not like it? Thumb up. Have you not yet subscribed to this channel? Don't be a bonefish. Do it now. Activate the notification bell feature. Share the joy of the channel with others. I'm Turk Strongman. Be well.